Thank you for joining me, General.
Great to be here.
Glad to hear it. So you advised the White House and helped draft the national security strategy, and it mentions China more than any other country. Why is that?
So, I mean, I have to take you all the way back 6 years if you're really interested, because I've been working on this issue for really the last 6 years. It started in the summer of 2013 when I went to the Council on Foreign Relations as a military fellow. And that was my first introduction to kind of the global business world. Met a lot of people in finance and business, and at the time, the Air Force was looking to send me to China at some point, and I knew that. And I wanted to get as smart as I could about how China interacted with the global community through business. And so I started asking questions. And you know, my going-in assumption at the time was that, and I think this is indicative of all Americans, is, you know, a sense of hubris, a sense that, you know, our model, our economic model, our social model is
number one.
Is number one. It's without reproach, and that you know, while China was growing at the time, it was its growth model had come to an end. It was going to stagnate, and then we were going to essentially flip the switch, the growth switch back on, and we were going to, you know, essentially climb away from it.
And China would become a democracy.
And China, well, no, China would become a poorer totalitarian country, which would at some point lead them to believe that, hey, we need to open up and become a democracy and so we can grow again like the United States. About this time I met one gentleman who's a businessman who had a lot of money invested in China and essentially lost a good portion of it during the financial crisis during 2008. Of course, had grown that back up. And then about 2012, 2013 had exited China as a market because he had realized that China was changing in ways that he couldn't predict where that investment might go in the future. And so our discussion when I first met him was over a lunch at one of the private clubs in New York. And we essentially got into an argument. I said, hey, they're going to stagnate, they're not going anywhere. And he said, oh no, they're not going to stagnate, they're going to grow. And they're going to grow and they're going to become the most powerful country in the world. And I said, that's just not, that can't be. You know, America's democratic, you know, society and free market system is much better than kind of the state-led model. And he says, you don't know what you're talking about. And I mean, the truth is, I'd spent 20-something years in the military, you know, focusing on how to go to war with countries, not how to go to business with them. And so, you know, looking back, it was, you know, it was evident that I didn't know what I was talking about, and he did. And so that led to a relationship where we, over the next year, corresponded. I eventually moved over to the Joint Staff to be the advisor on China to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he would send me periodically, send me data about, you know, China's economy, doing business in China, what was going on. And it was the fall of 14. He sent a briefing to me and sat in my inbox for about a week. And I opened the email up one day when I had, you know, a minute of peace in the Pentagon, and I started reading the briefing. And literally my mind broke because I realized that I did not know. You know, here I was, had a PhD in economics, a decorated, you know, military officer, and I did not know how the international world worked, and I suspected because of that, because of my background, that most people didn't know as well. And so this started an intense effort to really dig down deep into how everything from, you know, finance, trade, investment, immigration, the internet, media, politics, all of that, how it all works and how it serves. And what I found is how it has served China's, the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, I'm curious what
strategy.
Was in this briefing that blew your mind.
Yeah. So again, you have to go back to my background. I'm a B-2 pilot. Primarily, we train to take societies apart, right? If the U.S. wants to oppose its will, it has a political, essentially Clausewitz says war is politics by other means. One good example was the war in Kosovo. We sought to stop Milosevic. Again, the way that you create that political pressure to stop Milosevic is you eventually strangle his ability to control the country, and then they capitulate. So I had studied how to do this from the air with weapons. What I saw in that briefing, and because I had a doctorate in economics, could understand and fathom, was that here was a model for doing the exact same thing with economics. And
so
I said,
business becomes China's B-2 bomber.
Exactly, and it was actually kind of like the B-2, which is a stealth aircraft. It was a stealthy operation primarily because of our own laws. Companies can't talk about, and often are unwilling to talk about what happens to them, either because it affects their valuation, or because the general counsel in their company says you can't share that, or there's a general uneasiness about talking to government. And so in that briefing, I saw vignette after vignette of how specifically elements in China had gone after companies to put them under pressure, under duress, in order to acquire some specific piece of technology or intellectual property, and it was going on, across the country. And I said, okay, if this is happening, what else is happening? What else do I not know? And that, like I said, that started this entire effort. That led ultimately, I finished my tour in the Joint Staff. I went to be the defense attaché in Beijing, and eventually to work on the National Security Council, where by that time I had a good, fulsome picture of everything that was going on. And it really requires you to kind of look at the incentive structure of the system. The thing that America has patented and why we've been so successful, our democratic model aligned with the liberal capitalist system, is that we aligned private profit motive with national interest. In other words, if you're doing well, the country's doing well. What I found was China had done the same thing, except align your private profit motive wherever you were with their national interests. And so if you were doing well, China was doing well. And it was actually quite brilliant. And so basically, all I had to do at the National Security Council was help educate people on what was going on. Just like I had spent the prior 5 years teaching myself, or 4 years teaching myself about what was going on. Then it was just time to essentially share that with my colleagues. And once you start to understand how the world works along all of these different areas of globalization, then you understand that the system's actually set up so that a totalitarian regime can actually do quite well. And actually not just do well from an economic perspective, but also do well in terms of transferring their values into democratic societies. And so the so what of what I found was not that, in the Defense Department, we essentially prepare for war. That's what we do. And then we go to war if it comes to that. What I found was, the Chinese way of doing things didn't require war. It just required you to stay open for business. And that slowly it would allow the suppression of freedoms that we currently take, quite frankly, for granted. And so it's not just, hey, it's going to improve their economy. Hey, it's going to actually undermine your democracy.
Yeah, I believe they use the term unrestricted warfare to describe this.
Well, that was, I read that when it came out in 1999. I thought, well, this is preposterous. First of all, we're never going to go to war with China. We're never going to have armed conflict. We're two nuclear armed countries. Nobody in their right mind wants to go to war with a nuclear armed country just because of all the potential for risk and devastation. And so I discounted it, and it's because, quite frankly, the guys that wrote that were actually quite prescient. They could see into the future and see what openness would mean in terms of an incentive, or not an incentive, but an opportunity for China to essentially get gains at democracy's expense without creating any kind of risk whatsoever.
I think one really clear example you gave me was the example of the artificial islands China's building in the South China Sea. Why don't you tell us a bit about that and how that plays into the global market?
Right. So if you think about today how global finance works, a lot of it is done by index investing. In other words, an index tracks a certain set of companies, and institutional investors, retirement funds, basically invest in those companies based on what the index calls for. So recently, the MSCI Emerging Markets Index increased its weighting from 5 to 20%, and that results in a significant amount of money going to China in the next year. Over the next year, almost $1 trillion will go into China's stock market. That's money that's coming right out of our retirement funds. Now, some of these companies do things like build islands in the South China Sea, or build aircraft carriers, or help the oppression currently going on in Xinjiang. So, in essence, you have our retirement funds are being invested in things that, quite frankly, we call out from a national perspective. In other words, the Department of Defense is sending Navy ships within 12 nautical miles of illegal islands in the South China Sea, while our public employees are investing in those islands.
It's insane. So what would you say is the single biggest threat to the U.S. from China?
Well, I mean, when you say that in that way, it implies that that there's you can isolate it, right? It's so pervasive that you can't isolate it, and it's integrated as well. And so I think the single greatest threat is just their desire to maintain control, which requires that they essentially suppress speech, suppress freedom of religion, and really use oppression as a tool of government. All three of those things essentially were called out by FDR in his State of the Union address in 1941. And essentially those four freedoms became the basis of our international order. In other words, if you look at the Atlantic Charter, if you look at the UN Charter, there's two kind of fundamental pieces to that. One is free markets and the other is democratic principles. And that, and those were the things that specifically are called out in document number 9 as being not designed for the purpose of promoting what we believe to be kind of universal norms, but specifically designed to take down the Chinese Communist Party. So when you put unrestricted warfare together or with document number 9, essentially what you have is a theory of victory and a motive for that struggle, if you will. So it's their desire to maintain control, right, that really becomes a threat to our freedom.
So you see sort of the current Western world order that has these principles. That is incompatible with a China-led global order?
Absolutely, because essentially what they've done is they've taken the same four freedoms, and their social contract is built around the idea that, number one, the Chinese Communist Party is the only one that can return China to its rightful place in the world. Number two, in order for us to do that, we have a social contract with the Chinese people, and that social contract is we will essentially deliver continuous economic growth as long as you don't challenge our right to rule. And so basically the way that looks, if you take FDR's speech, it says we'll put freedom from want up at the top, and then you basically forfeit all the other three freedoms, and that's a social contract. So as long as we keep growing economically, you have no right to challenge our rule.
Well, so I guess the fundamental problem in the United States is that people they can look at China and see that the Chinese Communist Party has the largest standing army in the world. And they know that China is hacking the United States. But it seems like there's a lot of specific strategies the Communist Party is using that the American public might not be too aware of. What are some of those strategies?
Well, I already talked about global finance, how they use global finance basically. So they're $30 trillion in debt right now. They have a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls. Money, especially from elites, is trying to flee the country. They're clamping that down, and they're using the flow of capital from the West to kind of shore up their financial markets. In trade, you have essentially, and this is also within the country, you have very low regulation. In other words, if you look at trade from their standpoint, we have 4 inspectors. The United States has 4 inspectors in China. I believe 2 in Shanghai and 2 in Shenzhen. These inspectors are not allowed to look inside any containers. They get manifests, they may call out, hey, we think there's a problem here with this container. Of course, then the Chinese go and do the inspections on behalf of them. Then you have to deal with the fact that by Chinese law, there's no timeline required in terms of when you declare that container exported. So it can be already on the ship and gone. Also, a majority of the lading is done during the weekends, and if you're a Chinese customs officer, you're penalized if you slow down the lading process. So in essence, you have an export system that is completely, it sends everything that gets produced, which is why you have issues like fentanyl. Investment. The Chinese use finance to come out and look at even companies that our Defense Department is investing in to develop technologies. They wait till those can't find investment here in the United States because it's a tough business keeping a business going. If you're trying to prove out a new technology, they'll swoop in, they'll take the business, they'll take it back to China, they'll commercialize it, and then they got the technology for both their military and they export it back to the United States. Intellectual property theft, they're able to, because of our laws, one company can steal a technology, it can transfer that technology to another company in China. That company can produce the goods, send it, export it to the United States. So now they're making money, but because of discovery laws in our own legal system, the company that was originally ripped off has no recourse. And so along all areas of our connectivity, they have an ability to, essentially, they've re-engineered globalization to their advantage.
So they're using our laws to undermine us.
Our laws, our markets, our financial system, our media, our internet, you name it.
Well, so what is the U.S. doing about this?
Well, I think for the first time, we're actually beginning the process to understand it. And then, of course, because we haven't applied policy in a kind of a 21st century competitive format, we're trying to learn how to do that. And so the first step was a national security strategy, just identifying the problem, right? Because the federal bureaucracy is a huge organization, it's probably the hugest in the world. And so you have to identify the problem, but then once you identify the problem, that message has to be inculcated in a very large bureaucracy, and then after that, the bureaucracy has to figure out what does it do about it, right? It's not sufficient just to understand it. Now you have to figure out, okay, based on our laws, based on how globalization works, how do we fix things?
Okay. So in your mind, what would be the ideal U.S.-China policy?
I like the term decoupling. I think being coupled to China in such a fulsome way is actually damaging to our democracy. And so, there's a lot of people that say, hey, we should have no say in, what the Chinese Communist Party, the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And in some respects, I agree with that. That is up to the Chinese people. But I would say the relationship of the Chinese Communist Party with the United States is what I would focus on. And the less relationship we have, the better, I think, in terms of our future freedoms.
How would that be achieved, though? Because, I mean, our economies are so linked, it's hard to decouple that.
Well, if you go back to the before the WTO, every single year we had a vote in the Congress on whether to extend most favored nation status to the Chinese. Prior to that, no major American corporation would invest in any significant way in China, right? Because they need to have, large companies need to have stability in their operations. And so I think the more we understand about the problem, and the more that creates a need within the American people to say, hey, let's rethink the relationship, and let's actually see how it affects us is it in a positive way or is it in a negative way? As those questions begin to be asked, corporations are going to have to take a step back and say, does it make a lot of sense for me to have significant operations in China when they can be impacted by the relationship going forward? So I think in essence, those things are already beginning to happen. You're beginning to see corporations begin to rethink how they structure their operations abroad, particularly if they have significant operations in China. What they're hoping, and I think wrongly so, is that these trade negotiations make everything go back to normal. Once people begin to wake up to what's going on, I think you're going to see more and more calls, particularly in Congress, that we actually strictly look at the relationship for what it is and how it benefits or doesn't the United States people or the American people, and then do the right thing.
Okay. One final question. Do you think China is the next superpower?
No. I think, quite frankly, I think that, you know, we're going to go back, we're going to look back in history, we're going to say, after 2008, the Chinese Communist Party viewed itself as ascendant, and I think viewed its strategy as ascendant. And I think that caused them to do some things that actually, you know, they moved away from hide and bide, and I think in doing so exposed the Communist Party for what it is, and therefore allowed people to kind of wake from their slumber and understand what's going on. I think you can't put that back in the box. It's out for everybody to see, and now it's just a matter of, will democracies do the right thing, or they allow themselves to be essentially bought into co-opting their freedoms for profit.
Well, that was very enlightening. Thank you for joining us today, General.
Absolutely.